All right, let's dive into something truly monumental today. Literally monumental. The Coliseum. We're going to go beyond the typical touristy stuff, snapshots. Really get into the nitty-gritty. We've got historical records, architectural blueprints, even some poetry from the time. So this deep dive, it's all about unearthing what the Colosseum reveals about Roman society.
You know what's striking is? About the Colosseum, or as the Romans knew it, the Amphitheatrum Flavium. It wasn't just a building. It was like this massive reflection of Roman society. And we can trace that evolution from its earliest beginnings to the crazy spectacles that happened inside.
Speaking of those spectacles, I mean, the gladiatorial games, they immediately come to mind. But it sounds like from what I've been reading, they were a lot more than just the brutal blood sport that,
Yeah.
the Hollywood often portrays.
Oh, absolutely. To really get the complexity of the games, we need to go back to the beginning. They weren't designed for entertainment at first. They started as solemn funeral rites, almost like a bloody offering to appease the spirits.
So instead of a sporting event, it was something rooted in ritual and beliefs about death.
Exactly, the spilling of human blood. It was believed to appease the spirits. It made even some Romans uncomfortable, this tension between the games as a sacred ritual and them evolving into entertainment.
It's interesting to think about how that affected the crowd's experience. On one hand, you have the thrill of the fight, but on the other, there's this underlying unease about the violence, maybe even a sense of awe tied to the ritual.
Yeah, it really begs the question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Were the Romans really just bloodthirsty like they're always shown? Or was there something more, culturally and religiously, something deeper that we just overlook?
Our sources definitely point to something more nuanced than just bloodlust. The games weren't just about violence. They were carefully designed to reinforce Roman values, showcase their military might, and solidify the social hierarchy.
Exactly. And that's where the Colosseum itself becomes more than a backdrop. It's a carefully crafted statement, designed to impress everyone. With the power and grandeur of Rome.
It's interesting, because for the longest time, Rome, the heart of this giant empire, didn't even have a permanent amphitheater. They were making do with temporary structures.
Yeah, and that might seem weird. But those temporary arenas served a purpose politically. You had ambitious politicians sponsoring these extravagant games
Yeah.
and construction of these venues as a way to gain favor with the public.
So it was like a political one-upmanship, seeing who could throw the grandest, most lavish games
Yeah.
and win over the most votes.
The tactic that's still around today. But the decision to build the Colosseum, a permanent structure.
Of unprecedented scale, it signals a change in Roman politics and priorities.
And this shift coincides with the rise of the Flavian dynasty, right? Specifically Vespasian, an emperor who wanted to project an image of practicality and distance himself from the excesses of his predecessor. Yes, Vespasian choosing to build the Colosseum on the site of Nero's lavish pleasure palace. That was no accident. He was symbolically wiping away the decadence of the previous regime and showcasing a return to traditional Roman values. It was a smart move, transforming a symbol of imperial indulgence into a monument to the strength and unity of the Roman people.
Almost poetic, erasing Nero,
Yeah.
while simultaneously creating this lasting symbol of his own dynasty's power. But you've mentioned the scale of the Colosseum several times. Just how big are we talking?
The Colosseum was colossal,
Right.
literally. Its capacity ranged from 50,000 to a mind-blowing 80,000 spectators, considering the population of Rome at the time. It's just mind-boggling. It wasn't just about providing space. It was a deliberate display of opulence and engineering.
I can just picture this imposing structure dominating the Roman skyline, a constant reminder to the citizens of the empire's power and their place within it. But a project that big must have required tremendous resources. Where did they all come from?
Well, that's where the story takes a darker turn. Vespasian funded a large part of the Colosseum's construction, using the spoils of war from the conquest of Judea.
So the Colosseum was built, at least in part, on the backs of those Rome had conquered.
Sadly, yes. And the design itself even uses elements that remind you of that victory, like the prominent display of treasures. Taken from the temple in Jerusalem, it was blatant propaganda, meant to celebrate the Flavian dynasty and legitimize their rule.
It's amazing how much history is woven into the very fabric of this structure. Architecture, politics, war, even religious beliefs all intertwined. It's like peeling back layers of an onion, each one revealing a different facet of Roman life. But I'm curious to know what it was like to experience the Colosseum. You walk through those arches. What do you see? What emotions are swirling within those walls?
That's a great question. And luckily, we have sources that give us a vivid, if somewhat unsettling, picture. Remember, we're not just talking about gladiatorial combat. The Colosseum played host to all sorts of spectacles, each one seemingly more elaborate and exotic than the last.
Now you got my attention. What kind of events are we talking about? Animal hunts, chariot races, theatrical performances. What else?
Imagine exotic animal hunts, featuring creatures like lions, tigers, elephants, even giraffes brought in from the far reaches of the empire, to showcase the reach of Roman power.
I can't even imagine seeing a giraffe for the first time in ancient Rome. Talk about a spectacle.
And then you had these elaborate reenactments of myths and historical battles, complete with costumes, props, and special effects. These weren't just staged fights, they were choreographed performances, designed to transport the audience to another time and place.
Almost like a Roman Broadway show, but with a lot more danger.
Yeah.
And probably less singing.
Exactly. And woven into all of this was gladiatorial combat, the climactic event. That drew the biggest crowds and the most fervent fans.
Speaking of fans, it's interesting to think that even back then, people had their favorite gladiators, followed their careers, and cheered for their victories.
Absolutely. Gladiators were the superstars of their time, their fame bringing with it both fortune and a precarious existence. They were revered for their strength and skill, but they were also outcasts because they were slaves.
It's a strange paradox. To risk your life for the entertainment of others and be considered less than human.
That paradox is at the heart of the Colosseum's legacy. It's a monument that shows both the magnificence and the brutality of Roman civilization.
It almost acts as a microcosm of the empire itself, power, spectacle, and violence, converging in a way that it continues to captivate us. But we can't forget about the crowd, those tens of thousands of people crammed into this arena. What was their experience like?
Well, it wasn't all fun and games. The atmosphere was intense, fueled by the thrill, the anxieties, and maybe even a sense of religious awe, given the lingering belief in the ritualistic aspect of the games.
And the seating arrangements, they weren't random, were they?
Not at all. The seating was meticulously organized to reflect Roman social hierarchy. The closer you were to the action, the higher your status.
So the senators and the wealthy elites got the best seats, while the common folk were up in the nosebleeds.
You could say that. It was a visual representation of Roman social order built into the Colosseum itself. These games weren't just about entertainment. They were a powerful tool for reinforcing social control.
This really paints a picture of the Coliseum experience. I can almost hear the roar of the crowd, smell the dust and sweat, and feel the tension in the air.
And we haven't even touched on the darker side of these spectacles, the executions, the public displays of cruelty, the sheer scale of death and suffering.
That's where things get truly unsettling, and where we need to confront the complex moral questions surrounding the Colosseum and its legacy.
And that's precisely what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. Get ready to delve into the more disturbing aspects of the Colosseum's history, the stories that might make you question just how different we are from those ancient Romans.
So we left off talking about the darker aspects of the Colosseum, a side that's a bit harder to stomach. What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, let's go back to the ritualistic roots of gladiatorial combat, even as the games evolved into these massive spectacles that linked to death and the appeasement of spirits. It never really went away.
You're talking about the executions that were staged as part of the events, right?
Exactly. For the Romans, public executions,
Right.
they weren't just punishment. They were theatrical events, carefully choreographed to reinforce their sense of order and justice.
But how did that actually play out inside the Colosseum? Are we talking simple beheadings? Or did they get more,
Creative.
let's just say? The Romans had a flair for the dramatic, even when it came to executions. Our sources describe criminals being thrown to wild beasts, burned alive, or even forced to reenact scenes from mythology, often with fatal results.
So they were basically using condemned criminals as actors in these gruesome plays.
In a way, yes. And all of this was happening in front of thousands of people who saw these executions not just as punishment, but as entertainment, a reaffirmation of Roman power and their concept of justice.
It's hard to grasp that mindset today. It all just seems so barbaric, so inhumane. It's important to remember that Roman values and beliefs were very different from ours. For them, public executions served several purposes. They demonstrated the strength and authority of the state. They deterred crime, and they even provided a kind of catharsis for the audience.
I get that different times had different values, but some of these executions just sound incredibly cruel, even by Roman standards. Do our sources give any specific examples?
They do, and some are quite disturbing. The Roman poet Martial, for instance, he describes an execution where a man was chained spread eagle, and a bear was set upon him to gnaw at his intestines.
Oh, that's horrifying. And they thought that was entertaining.
What's even more unsettling is that this specific execution seems to be a deliberate reenactment of the myth of Prometheus, the titan who was punished by having his liver eternally devoured by an eagle.
So they weren't just torturing people for no reason. They were weaving in their mythology, their cultural narratives, to give these executions a deeper meaning, however twisted that meaning might be.
Exactly. It just adds another layer to how we see the Coliseum. It wasn't just an arena for blood sport. It was a stage for Roman culture, reflecting both its grandeur and its darkest impulses.
And speaking of dark impulses, earlier we talked about the erotic fascination with gladiators. Makes you wonder, if that played a role in the violence, was there a sadistic element tied to that fascination?
It's an interesting question, and one that Roman moralists struggled with. There's definitely a sense of anxiety in their writings about the erotic appeal of gladiators, especially for women.
So they were worried about Roman women swooning over these muscular, sword-wielding warriors.
Well, it wasn't just housewives. Roman satirists like Juvenal wrote extensively about women from all walks of life who were infatuated with gladiators, even having affairs with them.
Quite a scandal. But those affairs must have been risky, considering gladiators were slaves.
Absolutely. There were strong social taboos against those relationships, but they happened anyway. And for some Roman moralists, this is a sign of societal decay, a blurring of the lines between civilization and barbarity.
Do you think the violence of the games themselves might have fueled that erotic fascination? There's something thrilling, maybe even primal, about watching someone risk their life.
That's something that St. Augustine, centuries later, would explore in his Confessions. He writes about how a friend of his, who was initially disgusted by the violence, became completely captivated once he saw the blood.
It almost sounds like an addiction. Once you experience that thrill, that adrenaline, it's hard to turn away.
And that's a pretty unsettling thought, that even someone who opposes the violence at first can be seduced by it, drawn into the spectacle and the frenzy.
Makes you wonder if there's a part of human nature that's drawn to violence. A morbid curiosity that transcends time and culture.
It's a question that's just as relevant today as it was in ancient Rome. We may not have gladiatorial combat, but we certainly have our own forms of spectacle and entertainment that flirts with violence, that taps into that same primal instinct.
Think about modern boxing matches or the popularity of violent video games. Are we really that different from those Romans in the Coliseum?
It's something to think about, and it leads to a bigger question. How do we reconcile the undeniable appeal of the Coliseum, its magnificence, its influence, with the horrific violence that took place there?
It's a tough question. On the one hand, you can't deny the Colosseum's historical importance. It's a symbol of Roman power and ingenuity.
But on the other hand, it's a monument built on suffering, a place where human life was disposable entertainment.
It's that tension, that duality, that makes the Colosseum so fascinating and ultimately so unsettling.
Exactly, and it's that duality that we'll continue to explore.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at the decline of the gladiatorial games, the rise of Christianity, and the lasting legacy of this iconic and controversial landmark.
We've explored the Colosseum's grandeur and its dark side, and now I'm curious how it all ended. What led to the decline of these brutal games? Was it sudden or more gradual?
It was a gradual decline, influenced by several things happening at once, but one of the biggest factors was the rise of Christianity. As this new religion spread, its values clashed with the brutality of the games. Makes sense. Christianity, with its emphasis on compassion and forgiveness, they would found those bloody spectacles appalling.
Exactly. Early Christian writers really denounced the games, calling them barbaric and pagan. They argued the games glorified violence and stripped everyone of their humanity, both the gladiators and the spectators.
As Christianity grew, that criticism must have started resonating with more people, leading to a decline in the game's popularity.
That's exactly what happened. The last gladiatorial fights in the Colosseum, that we know of, took place around 435 AD, the end of an era that had lasted for centuries.
So after centuries of those crowds and the bloodshed, the Colosseum went quiet. What happened to this massive structure after the games stopped? Did it just crumble away?
Not exactly. The Colosseum story doesn't end there. It actually went through these fascinating changes, mirroring how Rome itself changed in the following centuries. It was used as a quarry for building materials, a fortress, even a chapel.
A chapel. That's a huge change from an arena of combat.
It really is. It shows you the lasting power of the Coliseum, its ability to be repurposed across different times and belief systems. The belief that Christians were martyred in the Colosseum, even though that's not historically accurate, that helped it become a place of religious significance.
It's incredible how the Colosseum has become like a historical palimpsest, each layer showing a different part of Rome's story. But how did it go? From a neglected quarry to the world-famous tourist spot it is today.
That took centuries, and it was partly driven by a growing interest in the classical world. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, people started seeing the Colosseum, not just as ruins, but as a monument to ancient Rome, a source of artistic and architectural inspiration.
And now millions of people from all over the world visit the Colosseum, drawn by its sheer size, its history, and maybe even a hint of that Roman fascination with spectacle and violence.
That's the paradox of the Colosseum. It both repels and fascinates us, makes us confront the complexity of history and the darker parts of ourselves.
It really makes you think, are we that different from those ancient Romans? Cheering in the Colosseum, do we still have that same fascination with competition, with spectacle, even with violence?
It's a question worth thinking about as you stand in front of the Colosseum. Imagine the roar of the crowd, the clashing swords, the blood on the sand.
Well, that's the story of the Colosseum, a monument that still speaks to us today. It makes us examine our relationship with history, with spectacle, and with the enduring allure of the past.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Colosseum. We hope you've learned something new about this iconic structure, and maybe even about ourselves.